You have all had notification of an urgent question, and I call on Mr Moorhouse, the member for Arbury Castletown-Maloo, to ask.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to ask the Chief Minister if he will make a statement on the suspension of the airbridge with Guernsey.
Call on the Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and it's an urgent question, but I have provided my answer to all honourable members. Just had it sent to them by an email just to help them with a bit of a statement. Thank you, Mr Speaker. As honourable members will be aware, the governments of the Isle of Man and Guernsey agreed to form an airbridge, allowing travel between the jurisdictions without the need for self-isolation on arrival. This airbridge is understood to have been the first established by any governments in the British Isles, as well as being the first airbridge between two jurisdictions within the British Isles. The decision to form an airbridge followed talks between the Chief Ministers of the Isle of Man and Guernsey, as well as both governments' public health teams. The airbridge provided a welcome opportunity for our residents and our friends in Guernsey to travel safely at a time when COVID-19 has put severe limitations on all of us to enjoy holidays that, at any other time, would have been taken for granted. The flights have proven extremely popular and have been a welcome source of custom for hospitality businesses in both jurisdictions. However, the airbridge was only possible due to the circumstances that both islands had managed to create through their handling of the pandemic. As we know, the situation is constantly changing and certainty is in short supply whilst the virus continues to spread. At its meeting on the 22nd of October, the Council of Ministers discussed the situation in Guernsey following a cluster of 4 cases of COVID-19 being detected on the island in the previous few days. Our Director of Public Health, Dr Henrietta Hewitt, is in close and regular contact with her opposite number in Guernsey, so we were quickly able to understand the latest developments there. Guernsey's index case, that is the first person to test positive for COVID-19, was detected on Monday the 19th of October. As with our recent suspected case, this result came about from an individual who was displaying no symptoms and only sought a test as they were due to travel to a country that requires confirmation of a negative COVID-19 result before entry is granted. Unlike our suspected case the week before last, however, this was not a false positive. This case was made particularly challenging by the fact that the individual had not left Guernsey in the past 14 days, and as Guernsey has no COVID cases in the community, the source of the infection was unknown. Due to the time course of COVID-19 infections, it is often impossible to confirm the source of sporadic community cases. It may be that the infection resulted from contact with someone who had travelled, had a negative test at day 7, but was in fact infectious after that, either because the test result was a false negative or because they were one of a small proportion of people who don't start shedding virus until later on in the possible incubation period. This is the risk we have sought to avoid by suspending our day 7 testing option and going back to the gold standard of 14 days of isolation. Alternatively, it may have been transmitted from someone who had broken self-isolation and who had not been caught. When 3 close contacts of the index case also tested positive for the virus, it took Guernsey's number of active cases to 4. But as they were all related to the index case, it meant that we were at least looking at a single contained cluster. The public health team in Guernsey quickly set to work carrying out test and trace. When the Council of Ministers met last Thursday, there were still around 60 test results of close contacts outstanding. We determined that the results from these tests would be crucial in helping us to fully understand the level of risk that the cases in Guernsey posed. I have often spoken of the balance of risk, the requirement for the Council of Ministers to weigh up costs and benefits of any given scenario. This is no different. Unfortunately, a further 3 cases were detected in Guernsey last Friday, taking the total to 7. Again, these are all linked to the index case. As a result, Council of Ministers took the decision that, in order to protect our community, The airbridge, that is self-isolation free travel between the Isle of Man and Guernsey, would be suspended from Friday with immediate effect. And I do emphasise the word suspended, Mr. Speaker. This is, I hope, a temporary measure, and I would very much like to see the airbridge restored when the longer-term situation in Guernsey is clear. Now, I know that this will have been bitterly disappointing for those who had visits to Guernsey booked, and to businesses here on the island that were looking forward to welcoming our friends from Guernsey. I know it will have been equally disappointing for the people of Guernsey who were planning to travel here. Following the decision to suspend the airbridge, our teams worked with Orkney to ensure that residents from both islands could get home. 2 repatriation flights were provided by Orkney over the weekend. As I said when announcing the development on Friday afternoon, this was not an easy decision to make. We took many factors into consideration: half-term, returning students and the approach of a complex Christmas period. It was a difficult decision, but one we feel was right for our island. The airbridge was established on the understanding that it could only operate while both islands remained free of any significant transmission of the virus. These latest positive test results meant that, sadly, the balance of risk had shifted. Guernsey's approach to managing the virus is very similar to ours here on the Isle of Man, and so I have every confidence they will quickly bring the virus under control. We will keep the situation under review, and I sincerely hope we are able to re-establish the airbridge as soon as possible. I'm sure you will all join me in wishing the people of Guernsey all the very best.
Supplementary question, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chief Minister, for that reassuring answer. Did any of the visitors from Guernsey have any links with the 7 positive cases, and what information about each visitor has been collected by the Isle of Man authorities? Thank you.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If you can just bear with me a second. I've got so many copious notes on this. I just want to check. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Regarding the data collected from people who have returned, arrivals from the Isle of Man from Guernsey were required to complete a landing form which collected personal data to enable contact tracing in the event that this was required. The landing forms were retained for 15 days following arrival before being destroyed in accordance with privacy notice. And at no time have we been made aware of anyone who has travelled to the island being in contact with the now 8 cases, I think. When we made our decision as a Council of Ministers, there were 7 cases of COVID in the community. Since we made that decision, there has been another case, taking it up to 8. And if I could also point out to all honourable members that it may not stop there. When you look at the experience of New Zealand, you have to allow for a 7 to 8 day period after you've tested all the people who were in quarantine as a result of the 7 tests and now 8 tests, to make sure that it wasn't a false negative as a result of them not yet shedding the illness, and that's why I think the decision we made was correct.
Supplementary question, Mr. Collister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Chief Minister for a statement this morning. Can I ask the Chief Minister what financial support and general support is now being offered to the 120 passengers returning from Guernsey who are now being asked to self-isolate?
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this moment in time, there is no support specific for those 120 people. If anyone there feels they are in financial hardship, then obviously the social security side of things from our colleagues in Treasury will be there to help. There is also, if there's any support needed for the businesses that have lost, there was circa 1,000 people were travelling backwards and forwards over this coming half-term period, and if any business has been substantially hit and that's affected their income, that then takes their income below the above the 25% reduction in the year, then that will now entitle them to support from the Department for Enterprise. But if any honourable member knows of anyone who is struggling as a result of this, who hadn't planned for the 14 days, maybe living on their own, if they could pass on the context to either our colleagues in the Department of Health and Social Care or my own office, and I will see that we do our best for them. Thank you.
Supplementary question, Mr. Robertshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I asked this question of the Chief Minister in order to assist my understanding of what his answer actually articulated. If it is the case that it is perfectly possible to have a negative test at 7 days and then still shed live viruses after that time, after the 7-day process, what was the advice that the Council of Ministers received when we went into the 7-day measure in the first instance? And the second part of my question is what is the longest time that's been identified that allows negative tests to occur and then live shedding afterwards? Is it 8 days? Is that something we can look at? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the honourable member for the opportunity to give, as the best of my capacity, clarification on this point. Sorry. The gold standard is 14 days. That's the one where it virtually catches anyone. If you isolate for 14 days and you respect the isolation, which our people on the Isle of Man have been in vast numbers, then that will stop people who are maybe not asymptomatic, not showing any signs whatsoever, from maybe unintentionally passing it on to people. The evidence clearly shows that you will catch the vast majority if you test after day 7 and then share the results on day 8, that the vast majority of cases will not be shedding after that. And that's why when infection rates were low in the United Kingdom, relatively low compared to where they are now, we went with risk, that we thought it was a risk that could be taken, that the 7-day testing for our residents coming back, given that there was maybe 100 cases per 100,000 in the United Kingdom, that when you took everything into consideration, that it was a safe bet to allow our people not to have the inconvenience of 14 days. However, when they went up to 600 cases per 100,000, which is sadly a chunk of the northwest, and I notice another areas going in the north into stage 3, we went to the gold standard, which our medics recommend, of 14 days, which hopefully catches, it's never 100%, but it catches nearly everything. That's the best advice that we've been given. And that's why it's currently 14 days, given the situation. I hope we can move back to the 7 days, Mr. Speaker, of testing for our residents, but the northwest especially is so significantly high with its infection rate per 100,000 that we feel that we're better off maintaining the gold standard of 14 days of isolation, quarantine, call it what you like. Thank you.
Supplementary question, Mr. Shimmins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few questions from me for the Chief Minister. Perhaps you could confirm that the Guernsey airbridge was a private sector initiative. And also, can the Chief Minister tell us what learnings are being taken from the Guernsey cases for the Isle of Man? And will these learnings be factored into the updated Council of Ministers testing strategy, which we understand was being worked on last week? And when will this strategy be presented to the honourable members of this House? Thank you.
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I missed the very first part of the honourable member's question about business. Could you repeat that, please?
Just to confirm that the Guernsey airbridge was a private sector initiative initially.
Chief Minister.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to confirm that it was a private initiative made by a travel agent based on the Isle of Man, as well as in Guernsey and Jersey, who were able to set this up. The governments, neither governments, though you could argue Guernsey maybe because they own Orkney, had any involvement. But on the Isle of Man, we were just concerned purely from a health and safety point of view and had our Director of Public Health deal with the procedures to ensure that their team was content that we went ahead in the first place with this. Regarding governments, I did say to all honourable members, Council of Ministers are having a workshop on this very topic on Thursday. We intend to have fortnightly discussions with all members of Tynwald on the latest thinking on COVID, and when we make decisions such as our changes to our borders, then we expect to have a workshop in the Brule Suite with all Tynwald members to discuss how we move forward. Obviously, I would hope that honourable members will trust the Council of Ministers to deal with the smaller or the really quick decisions that need to be made. I hope you can all see the reason why we had to pull the airbridge, and we needed to tell our people the minute we knew there was extra 3 cases over. And we only found out at just gone 12 o'clock when we had a presentation from our Director of Public Health on the Friday. We had a briefing at 1:20 telling people, because people were packing. There was 3 flights each way. There was 1,000 people that were going to be travelling between Guernsey and the Isle of Man, and we needed to ensure that they weren't suddenly finding themselves having to be brought back, etc., etc. So that sort of thing we've got to make quickly. But when it comes to our borders policy, we as a Council of Ministers will work on a paper which we will then, in our workshop, and they will then share with all honourable members of Tynwald in a workshop going forward, as well as updates on a 2-weekly basis on advice that we are receiving. And it's not just from our public health, Mr. President. There are a multitude of factors when we make these decisions, taken from all angles of government.
Supplementary question, Mrs. Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the Chief Minister for his information he's sharing with us this morning. But I'd like to query him in terms, he's just mentioned that honourable members will be given the chance to workshop the new regime that we perhaps moved to. Can the Chief Minister tell us, when he says that the Council of Ministers review this every 2 weeks, who are the advisers that they are receiving this advice from? Is that from within government only, or is it from outside? And would he think that there might be more public engagement and interest, obviously, in this subject, which is possibly the most important decisions that the government is going to have to make that will impact a generation? So can he tell us who are the advisers, what advice is given, and would he look to having it published openly and routinely, so that there can be transparency around the decisions that are made, where the advice is coming from and what those decisions are, and so that there can be genuine public engagement in the way the Isle of Man manages itself out of this pandemic? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Before I call on the Chief Minister to reply, I would say we're starting to broaden out the questions, so I'm going to allow just one more supplementary question after this. Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the Council of Ministers sits every Thursday, it has 3 members, always, of the Gold Committee that advises Council of Ministers sitting there. It then normally will have, not all the time, but it will have a further 3 members of the Gold Committee on a video link brought in specifically to discuss the COVID. So we have a fair representation of the Gold Committee advising the Council of Ministers when we make our decisions. On top of that, we ask for papers from all of our advisers to be brought to the Council of Ministers so that we can make decisions. So we can have up to 6 members of the Gold Committee for the Council of Ministers to ask further questions based on the information we've received in a paper from the Gold Committee, and that will start off in the bronze, up to the silver, up to the gold. There's circa 20 people that sit on the Gold Committee, and they are made up of representatives from the Department for Enterprise, from the Department of Health and Social Care, from the Department of Infrastructure, the Department of Home Affairs, anyone that we think is able to bring a valued point. And they will have been speaking to people outside of government on the problems that are being faced, etc. So all that information is collated from bronze up to gold to the Council of Ministers, and we always have, as I said, a minimum of 3, if not 6 people able to answer questions to anything the Council of Ministers wish to have from a clarification point of view, Mr. Speaker. I have answered before that whilst I'm more than happy to have workshops and give briefings, some of the information, would we get it if people thought it was going to be shared all over the place? I think not, and therefore to make sure that people are as frank with us as possible, I won't commit to sharing everything, but I will commit to briefings where members can ask whatever they want of the team to get as much information as possible, and a workshop obviously on something like the borders, which is incredibly important, and we need as much input as possible from honourable members, and where we will be able to explain the problems that maybe not everyone is aware of, and you can all then take it into consideration.
Final supplementary, Mr Robertshaw.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. If I can return to the Chief Minister's kind answer to my previous question with regard to why the Council of Ministers took the decision to go to 14-day testing as a direct consequence of the level of infection rates in the northwest, which I understand. Did the Council, bearing that in mind, did the Council of Ministers consider a more nuanced approach to the Guernsey airbridge, bearing in mind there was very limited infection rates in Guernsey? Did the Council of Ministers consider retaining a 7-day test for those people returning back from Guernsey, or did you feel it was absolutely necessary to impose this sudden closure on people's circumstances where they'd already arranged carefully to travel both from Guernsey to the Isle of Man and in reverse? Does the Chief Minister think that perhaps Council of Ministers could have been more nuanced in this regard?
Chief Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And I don't thank the Honourable Member for his question, because yes, we did think of that. We did think, could we do a 7-day test for those coming back just from Guernsey? But we moved to 14 days, Mr Speaker, on the evidence and advice from our medics. That's why we moved. That's the gold standard. There was concern about the increase. The 14 days is seen as gold standard. If once Guernsey had it in the community, the advice was that we could not treat them separately from UK residents, and therefore it had to be the 14 days. But that's, I know personally, I was, all of us were looking at ways of helping those people from the island who had gone away and then found themselves in the unfortunate position that they have to isolate for 14 days. I'm sorry it's happened to them. It could have happened to me when I went there with my wife a few months ago. It was a risk that everyone knew was there. We'd said, we would have to pull it if there was a case. We hoped it would never happen. Sadly, it has happened. Fortunately, whilst I feel every disappointment for the 120 people affected, circa 120 people, because we made the decision the minute we knew the cases had gone over 5, we were able to ensure that the large number who would have been infected weren't impacted. But it was a tough decision, but we were advised that we couldn't treat one differently from the other. It was better to do the 14 days, and that's advice that we took. But it was a very difficult decision.